Hey, welcome everybody. We have another debate today. That's 2 for 1 today. This one's going to be on a completely different type of subject matter from the Dragnaut G-Man debate that was on Mac Revolution. This is going to be on more of a theological tone. This is going to be topic is going to be: does the Abrahamic God exist as anything other than an object in the mind? And it's going to be moderated by Nikolai H, aka the Doctor. And I'm going to be kind of paying attention, but I do have things I need to take care of, so I'm turning it over to them. They're going to have the debate. They have it already structured out, and then might open it up afterwards. If he needs to get a hold of me, he knows how to do that. But I will watch it afterwards at some point, so I will pay attention at some point. So, anyways, go ahead and take it over. You have all the mods you need, and I will listen as I can. The Doctor, are you there?
Yeah, I thought. So the format of the debate will be going with 8-minute openings, followed by 8-minute rebuttals to the openings of the individuals, followed by supplementary secondary rebuttals, which will be 5 minutes, 4-minute conclusions, and then a 5-minute free-form cross-examination questioning. And Achiwawa, I believe you agreed to go first, so your 8 minutes starts whenever you're ready. Just give me a notification.
Okay. Can you hear me?
Yep, we can hear you fine.
All right. So I'm going to go ahead and start. So we're talking today about whether or not the Abrahamic God exists, and I have 8 minutes to prove the existence of this God. So I'm going to go real fast. All right. So first, we need to find what God is. So you might remember this classic Dark Matter 2525 description of God. And some people might think of this as God, like some magic man in the sky with a beard or something like that. If that's what you mean by God, I also agree with you. This God does not exist. So my definition of God comes from the Abrahamic tradition. And as St. Thomas Aquinas said, the most proper definition of God can be found where he defined himself inside of the burning bush in the story of Moses. So in this story, he said, "I am he who is." What exactly does that mean? Well, according to the tradition of the Abrahamic tradition, it's been interpreted as the following. Finite beings are defined by their essence. God can be defined only by being, pure and simple, nothing less and nothing more. So basically, from the Abrahamic tradition, we get the definition of God as being the necessary being. So, and this is the most proper definition according to tradition. So can we prove that this God exists? Okay, so I have an argument here. The first premise is everything that is changing is being changed by something else. Second premise is that the series of changes and things changing cannot be infinitely long. Therefore, there must be a first cause of all change, which we call God. So I'm going to go through each of these premises. The first premise is again, everything that is changing is being changed by something else. This is ultimately founded upon this statement here. Whatever exists must have that in virtue of which it is distinguished from nothing, either in itself or from another. So let's go through this. This seems to be evidently true because there's no contrary possibility. So if something is not distinguished from nothing, for example, then it is nothing. And also, if something was distinguished from nothing by nothing, well, that just wouldn't make any sense because nothing is nothing. So how would it distinguish nothing from nothing? It doesn't make any sense. So that seems evidently true. What about this second part? So some people might say things are distinguished by something in itself, like in virtue of something within itself. Now, I'm ultimately going to argue that this is true for at least one thing, but for normal everyday things, this doesn't seem to be true. As according to Immanuel Kant said, existence is not a predicate or a determination of things. This proposition seems strange and absurd, but it is indubitably certain. Take any subject you please, for example, Julius Caesar. Draw up a list of all of the predicates which may be thought to belong to him, not accepting even those of space and time. You will quickly see that he can either exist with all these determinations or not exist at all. And I don't agree with everything Kant says, but he has an interesting point here, and that is we can define anything down to the very particular, down to the very details, right? We could define exactly what an alien is, for example, but knowing what an alien is different from knowing whether or not aliens exist. These are two different questions. So we see that there's a distinction between what a thing is and that a thing is. That is, in traditional terminology, essence and existence. So that just means that you can't determine from what a thing is that it exists. And if you could, that would mean that it would necessarily exist. Yeah. So this doesn't seem to be the case, at least for most things that we think of, like chairs and the universe and anything else that's finite. So it has to be from another for most things. The reason that which distinguishes something from nothing. So how does it relate to change? So change is ultimately the reduction of some potential to some actuality. And potential in and of itself, so for example, we have the potential for a building and then it becomes actual. But the potential for a building in and of itself is indeterminate with respect to being, right? So if you think about it, this is related to this essence and existence distinction, because essence in itself is only potential, whereas existence is actual, right? So ultimately, the idea is that you have to have something actual to make something potential. It has to be, again, dependent upon, it has to be something that distinguishes it from nothing. All right, so that's my defense of the first premise. The second premise is that the series cannot be infinitely long, right? So this is, again, based upon this distinction. It doesn't matter how many of these things you put over here, they don't have existence in and of itself. So it still needs to be distinguished from nothing by something, right? Okay, so even whenever it comes to bricks, for example, some people might say, okay, fine, the bricks are made actual by the bricks. Or sorry, the building's made actual by the bricks. But this doesn't really work for several reasons. For one reason, bricks in themselves, they change. So they have to be potential in some respect. And in that respect, they are not determinate with respect to being. Also, the whole depends upon its parts for its existence and change. So in and of itself, the brick doesn't exist. And what it is, it doesn't exist because it depends upon its parts for its existence. So you could say, okay, fine, we can actualize the bricks by the parts of the bricks, and that's what makes the bricks actual. But you're going to have the same problem with this as well, because all of the same objections apply to the parts of the bricks that apply to the whole of bricks. So again, we can do the parts again, and so on and so forth, and you see how this infinite series can build up. But it doesn't matter because, again, what a thing is in itself doesn't exist, not in of itself. It doesn't matter how many different things you add that don't have existence in and of itself. It still has to get its existence from another. I like the way that Reginald Garrigou-Lagrange put it. If the whole cosmic series constituted the necessary being, this would be the same as saying that 100,000 idiots constitute one intelligent man. And that's because, again, in and of itself, these things are not actual. They don't have that which would make it actual, right? And it doesn't matter how many things you add, because you got to get the existence from another. So ultimately, we have to start out with a first cause, right? And this first cause, if its existence is not its essence, if what it is not existence.
30 seconds.
Gotcha. Then it would have to get its existence from another and wouldn't be the first cause. So ultimately, you have to have a first being of which essence is existence. And so from change, we get this idea of a necessary being, a being that exists by definition, pretty much. And we get the same thing from the Abrahamic tradition. And so therefore, God exists.
Time. That was perfect. 8 minutes.
Yep.
All right. Deconverted man, go ahead.
All right. Deconverted man here. All right. Lobsters exist. Now to the thing. Does the Abrahamic God exist as anything other than an object in the mind? Clearly, the concept of gods that we've been exposed to exist in our mind, and gods we've never heard about and do not know can't exist in our mind because, well, we haven't heard about them. God concepts are delivered by and from humans. We can write down anything about a god and what it supposedly said and or did. We can get others to think that such things happen. We see that people can and do believe in all sorts of things without any evidence to do so. The cargo cults are a perfect example of how people can and do believe in and worship just about anything. We also know that people can make up fantastic stories, and we know that others can fall for such stories. Joseph Smith, for example, made up the idea of finding some golden plates. There's a whole new telling of Jesus' adventures in America. Oliver Cowdery and others went along with the idea. Church went through prosecution, and even the inventor was killed, yet people believed it anyways. No evidence for any of the things happening that the holy text claimed to have happened. And we can observe from outside that changes have been made to those holy texts because we have some of the older Bibles of the Mormon books around. But that doesn't matter to the believers. We consider now the Bible, and the way that the Old and New Testament was transmitted from person to person was oral. And when it finally did get penned in, there was a Jewish tradition that whenever an old version would get worn out, someone would copy it by hand and then burn the old one. Yep, burn the old one right on up. That practice, I think, might have been performed by early Christians as well. So anything that existed to show that there was major changes is gone. That's pretty convenient. We also have the issue of history not aligning with the Bible at all. We know from science there was not a single man and woman that started the human species, both from evolution and because of incestual breeding that would have bottlenecked us into oblivion long ago. Who was Cain's wife? It would have had to have been his sister. We know that the Egyptians used mostly paid labor for the construction of the pyramids, and there was not a vast amount of Jewish people portrayed in the Bible at that time. And in fact, no evidence of Jewish people being there at that time exists. The problems only grow from there for the Old Testament. But what about the new one? Well, without Adam and Eve, Jesus' whole lineage is thrown into question. And speaking of Jesus, let's just address the narrative of the crucifixion. There's a blackening of the sky. Well, that would have been a solar eclipse. Somebody should have reported that. There was a shaking of the ground, an earthquake that nobody said anything about. And then the fabric in the temples tore asunder, yet the Jews didn't record this event? Impossible. The whole New Testament reads as a narrative, not as history. We have the all-seeing narrator take us along the adventure of Jesus and his friends. Jesus one day goes out by himself, mind you, to the desert to be tempted by the trickster that later becomes the devil. Well, who the bleep was there to know that that was going on? Only an all-seeing narrator could make a story like that happen. It's made up, whole cloth. It's a work of mythology. But so what? So what if there's no evidence of God of any kind? So what if the Bible has nothing to support itself historically? Only a handful of locations and kings being confirmed. So what? God could still exist. Just because we made up God, that doesn't mean that God is just made up. That's the genetic fallacy, don't you know? Okay, so we don't have evidence or tests, but we have these arguments that happen to have logical fallacies in it. But trust us, you just don't understand how to understand the argument, and you just really want to sin, and you'll be sorry when you die anyways. I suppose it's rather dull just mentioning facts that there's no positive support of this God's existence, so I have to have some sort of argument. And in this case, I'm going to assume that there's a God of some sort and show that why, even if there was one, it could not know anything at all. Here's that syllogism. Premise 1, to have knowledge, there needs to be a reality on which to base knowledge. Premise 2, in order to have knowledge of the universe, there must be a universe to know about. Premise 3, if there was an eternal being alone prior to the existence of the universe, it could only know itself. Conclusion, without the existence of a universe, such an eternal being would not have knowledge of the universe. Empirical evidence of a God would be nice. I'd like to be able to see this God. Repeated testing would be great. God of the Old Testament has a test where Baal worshippers really get pwned. Some Christians have told me that God doesn't change, yet we can't do that same test today. Well, why not? Reasons. I guess that leaves us with a possible valid and sound argument for this God existing outside of the mind of humans, something I've never encountered. But even if we were presented with that, it wouldn't be evidence, but we should follow the conclusion further if it was a logically coherent argument. And unless and until we have one, we should be skeptical of the conclusions. That's it.
Okay, Deconverted Man finished with 6 minutes. I guess that moves us right into the first set of rebuttals. Chihuahua, you have the floor.
Sure. Yeah, I'll go ahead and do that. It'd be nice if he could put that syllogism like on the side chat, and I'll put mine over there as well after I'm done with this part. Okay, so hold on, let me share my screen here. Okay, so you guys can see this?
Yeah, we can see it.
Okay, so he went over a lot of things, like the history and stuff, and I mean, I could go into that, but I think that it's doesn't really pertain to the topic. So, but he did bring up a few things. First of all, he's brought up logical fallacies. So I hope that he goes into the logical fallacies that I made, that he claims I made in the next part. And then he also talked about whether or not God has knowledge. So I will go into why God has knowledge here. So first we need to talk about what is knowledge. So, you know, we have the basic idea of how we get knowledge. We have light that reflects off an object and it enters into our eye. And then we determine, it's a glove, right? Okay, but it's a little bit more complicated than that, actually. If you look at the story, the man who mistook his wife for a hat. This is actually a clinical study or clinical story of a man who did not have the ability to abstract the forms or what a thing is, the essence of a thing. So he, for example, he took this glove, one of the examples, and he saw what it was. He could describe each of the particular things, like it's made of leather and stuff like that. But whenever he tried to say what it is, he said, a coin purse. It's a coin purse. So yeah, he didn't have the ability to abstract what a thing is from the particular accidental forms. And the reason for this, I would say, is because what a concept is in and of itself is it applies universally to all gloves. It's not a particular thing. It's shared by different things. It's ultimately immaterial because it's not particularized, right? And so in order to, there's something that happens in our brain, we don't know what it is, that can abstract from a universal principle from particular things. And that is what I call knowledge, the immaterial form of things, what it is. So something to point out is that any composite depends upon its parts for its existence. And as I mentioned, God, he can't be in any way composite because he must be the foundation of the change in things. He would be in some way potential. He wouldn't be the first cause that's purely actual. So, and also we need to consider that whatever is in the effect must pre-exist in the cause, right? So as Edward Feser said, if there were some aspect of an effect that didn't come from its total cause, then that would involve a potency that was actualized without anything doing the actualizing, which would violate the principle of causality. So because God is immaterial, everything that exists must pre-exist in God in an immaterial way. And this is what I would call knowledge. right? So ultimately, I would say that God does have knowledge because he has the forms of everything that exists in a material way. In fact, that would make him omniscient since he's purely actual. And it exists in him in a simple way with all the perfections. Yeah. So, and then he also said that one other thing he said that I want to address is he said that even if we could prove God through a logical argument, that wouldn't show that there's evidence. I'm not sure what he means by evidence then, and I'd like him to clarify that if he gets a chance. And I will yield my time at that point.
Okay, we'll move over to Deconverted Man's rebuttal of Chihuahua's opening. Tell me when you're ready to start.
I'm gonna go. Okay, so we have in essence the argument from motion, and there's a couple of things going on with this argument. It relies on, to some extent, deductive reasoning, and the idea of things needing causes or change, however you want to put it, only works in the universe up to a point into the past, because physics as we understand them just breaks down. So we cease to be able to talk coherently about what's going on in the universe at somewhere around t.00, whatever the bleep it is, time. And we have no idea what that universe is like, so we don't know what it could or couldn't do. So that's one problem. As far as God moving anything, well, there's no space, so I'm not sure how God could move. And if there's a prior, well, there can't be a prior because time doesn't exist either. But both of those things are completely ignored by God because it's God, I guess. So before God thinks X, is there a thought that precedes that? Well, then there can't be, because then that would be an infinite regress. But then God can't also be infinite because there can't be an infinite regress, so he's just eternal, which is different than infinity somehow. Okay, so God is not a magic man in the sky. That's nice. The definition of God is from an appeal to tradition, so I dismiss it as such. It's also an appeal to scripture, dismissed as such. It's a necessary being, which is nothing more than a tautology. You just can't define something into existence. The tautology of Deconverted Man is I'm a millionaire, therefore I'm a millionaire. Doesn't work like that. And premise one should be as far as we have observed. We can't talk about things we haven't observed, what we have not observed yet. The second premise is unproven, and again has problems with God being infinite, or possible problems of there. If God can't change and then changes the universe or makes a universe, what is God changing to do that? I thought God couldn't change, or maybe God can change. But how does that work? And if God is changing, then it violates the entire argument. So God can't change, but he has to change what's outside of God. But there's nothing outside of God because God's all that exists. So how does any of that work? I think that covers pretty much all of that. Yeah. So we've got the fallacies, at least one of them, and all I need is one, is that we have an appeal to tradition, appeal to scripture, and because of that, I'm skeptical of the rest of everything else. But there's other additional fallacies. So that's all I got.
All right, so you're conceding the remainder of your time because you got like 5 minutes left.
Yeah, we'll save it for the Q&A or what have you.
Okay. So now we'll be moving on to the rebuttals of the rebuttals, where you each try to make the best defense in light of the objections that your opponents have raised. Chihuahua, you begin.
Okay, I wasn't unmuted. Okay, hold on a second. All right, so he wanted to know. Okay, so first of all, he said physics, right? The problem is that Physics can't ultimately debunk what we're talking about here because, if I can find it, it's founded upon this, which is completely valid, and no matter what universe you come from, because it's founded upon the principle of identity and the principle of non-contradiction. Because you're going to contradict yourself if you're going to say that God is not distinguished from nothing. Because if it's not distinguished from nothing, then it is nothing. So the foundation of this argument will apply to everything that exists because it's a law of being. Anything that exists is going to have that which distinguishes it from nothing. So yeah, I don't think that the physics argument applies here. There's one more slide thing that I want to pull up here. So he asked, how does God make things, right? So, oh, one thing I do before this. He said that it appeals to tradition, right? So I wasn't appealing to tradition to show that God exists. I was appealing to tradition to define God, right? Because we're talking about the Abrahamic God, so I have to define what I mean by God and what the traditional Abrahamic definition of God is. I'm not saying that Moses actually existed or anything like that. That's not even necessary for my argument. So yeah. All right, so how does God make things exist? So like I said, there's this distinction between essence and existence. So ultimately, the way this works, so basically God adds existence to the essence. That's by being the existence. That's the basic idea. So here's some basic points I brought up. Being in and of itself is infinite in forms of actuality. Okay, that's because it's ultimately applies to everything that could possibly exist. It's a ground for possibility. The essence of finite things is the finite degree to which things participate in being. So God isn't really changing things. He's just making them exist. He's making them actual. Things participate in being, which gives them the ground for their existence. Essence and existence are distinct because things participate in being in a finite way. So they are actual in a sense when they exist, but only because they participate in being in a finite way. That's what distinguishes them. And I think I have one more thing here, if it'll load. Okay, in God, all of the infinite possible forms of actuality exist materially, as I said, as knowledge. All right, so if we think about it, the way that it works in the Abrahamic tradition, right, we have let there be and then light, where light is ultimately the essence. It's what the thing is, and let there be, which is the essence, the existence of the thing. So you can think of this in terms of being as conceived and being as conceiver. And whenever it's finite things, it's a finite thing that's conceived. And God knows these things through knowing himself, since they pre-exist inside of God. He said that, well, you'd have to know that they exist before they exist. Oh, that's not really true. God knows that they exist because he's creating them. He knows them at the time that he's creating them because his knowledge is actually the cause of their existing, right? And another thing, being as known completely, as wholly known, as conceived, has traditionally been known as the Son, the Word, Jesus Christ, and willing, and God necessarily wills Jesus Christ, his Son, because he sees it as good. So it's known as the Holy Spirit. So in creating things, this is how it works. In creating things, God wills things.
30 seconds.
Sure. God wills things only in willing himself as the end. And in the being as conceived and being as conceiver, you get the unity of essence and existence. And you get something that exists. And I guess I'll stop there.
All right, Deconverted Man, you have 5 minutes to respond to his objections to your points.
Okay, that was the points that I made regarding the syllogism I gave, in essence. And God knows things because it just knows things in a different way than we do. And it just requires an entire whole separate category of ways of knowing things. So special pleading 101 is what I would call that. So it just knows these things in a whole different way because it's God, and that's just how it works. Trust me on this. As far as brains and how we conceive of things, brains are complex and they can misunderstand reality. That's why we should be skeptical. And that's a problem that I guess God built into the system. Well, that's great. But yeah, that's all we have is the idea that God could know stuff is because it knows these things because it's God. And that's a circular argumentation. It's a tautology. It's an unproven assertion. There's nothing in it. It's just a void idea. Anyone can say that about anything. I can define myself as a millionaire and argue myself into being a millionaire. It doesn't work like that. My opponent asked to clarify, I believe, what I meant by if we had a coherent argument, that we wouldn't have evidence. Well, arguments are not evidence of anything. They are not proof of things. Arguments, even when valid and sound, just mean we should look at the conclusion further. See, there's a thing called the fallacy, which states that if you say that, well, because the argument sucked, that the conclusion's false. Well, no, that's not necessarily true. The conclusion might be true, but we don't know, and we can't know. That's the whole exercise of logic, is to say, well, because you screwed up your argument, we're going to be skeptical of the conclusion. Yeah, my light is off, but the premises of there being lobsters had nothing to do with the conclusion. Whether lobsters exist or they don't, if they do, then my light's off. Well, okay, my light's off, but that didn't follow. So the argument sucks, and therefore we're skeptical of the conclusion. But the reverse could be true, that the conclusion to a logic and sound argument might be valid within logic, but it might turn out to be false in reality. I've never seen that argument, by the way. I don't know if it can exist, but because I'm skeptical, I say, well, that means if we were presented a logically sound argument for anything, be it God or anything else, that doesn't mean that that is automatically true. We should investigate to see if it's really true. And if logic is sound, it should be true. It should work out. So far it has. Who knows if somebody clever will come along and destroy all that. But so that's what I meant by that arguments are not evidence in and of themselves, even when they are valid and sound. That's not how they work. That's not how they function. I think I covered all the things from his rebuttal there. So that's all I've got.
Okay, so that takes us into the conclusions for the arguments. And how Chihuahua, you go first.
Okay. Well, so I'm no slides for this one. I just want to say that I don't think that I'm still not really clear on why he doesn't think it's evidence. Typically, in philosophy, we do say that if the premises are true and the argument is valid, then the argument's sound. Then that means that the conclusion follows, at least when it's deductively true anyway. So yeah, I think that I've provided satisfactory proof for the existence of God. And I don't think he didn't address at all, and I probably bring this up in the cross-examination, he didn't address at all what it is that distinguishes something from nothing. So I hope that we can get into that. But yeah, I'll conclude there.
All right. So I'll wait for the mod to switch us.
All right, so that was your conclusion?
Yes.
Okay, so you can go whenever you're ready, Deconverted Man.
Yeah, I was just going to ignore the rules and go anyways. Sorry. My bad. Well, my conclusion, and in reference to my saying that there was an appeal to tradition of what God is. Well, without a definition of God, then what is God? We don't know. And that's kind of my point, is anybody can say that God is anything. And anybody can make that up. And people have made that up. And all we hear about God is from people who can make up stories. So just saying, well, God is this because I said God is this doesn't make God that. And so appealing to tradition or scripture or anything else to say, well, God is X, Y, and Z doesn't help us to get to that. We need to show that God is that first. And I understand there's a problem of doing that since, well, as I submit, God's an object in the mind, and you can only point to it existing in the mind and not anywhere else. The whole point of my argumentation, the syllogism, as well as the problems of the history of the Bible and religions and God concepts in general, is that for everything else we have empirical evidence so far or a repeatable test so far. The only time that it seems we ever need to have a logically coherent argument is when one or two of those things is absent. And it's rare that both are absent. And it seems that the only time that both are absent is when we're talking about abstract objects like numbers or letters or musical notes or God. These things don't have empirical evidence or repeatable tests in the same way that other things do, but they do tend to have logically coherent arguments. At least numbers and letters and musical notes would have that for them. So we can be somewhat sure that they exist in our mind, if nothing else. And for God, yeah, the concept's there, but we can't move beyond that point without just asserting, well, it has to be because reasons. And the reasons given rely on multiple logical fallacies, rely on special pleading, rely on assertions of tautologies that God is this way, God must be this way, this is how God works. And I'm sure a clever person can come up with all sorts of things like that. As far as arguments not being proof, that's within informal logic. So I guess I'll say, unless and until we have, still skeptical of the conclusion. Less than until we have. Yes, I'll just end it like that.
Okay, are you finished there, Deconverted Man?
Yeah.
Okay, so that moves us into the relatively informal cross-examination of one another, where I believe, Deconverted Man, you will be going first, asking Achiwawa a series of questions, as many as you can within a period of 5 minutes, unless Achiwawa wants to go first.
No, that's fine.
Okay. And bear in mind, I will be free to interrupt if I feel that someone is evading the question or if the question is going nowhere, and I can just simply say for you to move it along. All right, so whenever you're ready, you have 5 minutes, Deconverted Man. Go ahead.
Okay. Now when you were explaining how God makes things, you said that he's just kind of like making them exist, so he's not changing anything. So then the whole argument of change just kind of goes out the window when we're talking about how God actualizes things at that point. Then, like, at what point does the argument apply, and then at what point does it stop applying to God?
Yeah. So, I mean, it's not that I don't think that God is changing things. I'm just explaining that the way that he is changing things, right? But it's in a different way. It's more that he's causing things to be actual, right? And that's sort of like the foundation for change. So like the way that it would be change is like, so say that right now he's sustaining me in existence, and then tomorrow he's not sustaining me in existence, right? That would be a change, if that makes sense.
Well, it sounds like a lot of equivocation for changing there.
Well, I won't ask a question because it's your turn.
I mean, wouldn't you? I would just say that, you know, it's well, but what is there to change? All that exists is God, right? I mean, before everything else exists, the only thing that's there is God.
Well,
So
I think that's a mistake because God doesn't. There is no before for God because
right, there's
timeless.
no time, right? I'm not
Right.
sure how God can do anything because there's no time to do it in.
Okay, so how does God cause things without changing? So this is it's not necessarily true that things have to change in order to change other things. Think
Okay,
about
so your argument no longer applies then. The first argument you gave no longer applies then.
why.
Because it's no longer, we don't need change anymore.
I
You
said
can't have it both ways.
I said it's not necessarily true that something has to change another thing. That's the
Okay.
conclusion of my argument. So the reason why I think that is because, so think about a teacher, for example, who's teaching them about the argument for motion, right? Now, when he's teaching the argument for motion, he's imparting this knowledge of the argument for motion to the students, and the students they have it actualized and it's in their mind, right? But think about it. Does the knowledge of the argument for motion change in the teacher? It doesn't. Now, he does have to change in speaking and in vibrations throughout space and time to reach the students, but that's only because he's separated from them by space and time. God isn't separated from things by space and time, so he doesn't have to change things.
Sounds like a lot of equivocation, but okay.
Well, you also have to realize that I'm not equivocating because I use analogous language. I think that the things in the world and God are analogous, but they're not equal. They're not the same. So when I say
there's
there's
a special pleading required for God.
why? How does that follow?
Well, and it goes back to the whole that how does God know anything at all argument that I gave, in that you just essentially have built a tautology where God just knows everything. It's just all part of God. All this stuff is all things that it knows just because it does.
Well, it's because
Why?
It's because things must pre-exist inside of their cause, in order for them to exist.
But you can't apply that as a universal without having observed the entire universe.
Well, it's based upon the argument I gave for the first premise, which is universally applied because it's based upon or it's not based upon, but it would contradict the principle of identity if it weren't true. If it weren't true that something has to be distinguished from nothing by something else. So it has to be universal.
30 seconds before a question switch.
Oh, okay. Well, go ahead then. I the rest of the time, let him. I'm done.
Okay, go ahead, Chihuahua. If you have any questions, you have 5 minutes to ask him whatever questions you wish.
Okay. So how would you answer the question? Like, what is it in virtue of which something is distinguished from nothing?
Well, I don't know that I can answer the question because I'm not sure what nothing means in this context. So could you clarify?
Yeah, nothing is the absence of anything.
I don't know what that is. I've never observed an absence of anything.
So take anything that exists.
Right. But I'm saying that my answer would be that because I've never observed that sort of nothing, I don't even know that sort of nothing actually exists anywhere. So
well, it doesn't.
Right.
I agree. It doesn't exist.
So then there's only stuff.
It still has to be different from nothing, though. If it were nothing, then it wouldn't exist. So.
Well, but I'm saying the entire concept of nothing is just a concept, that it doesn't. There is no quote nothing, at least as far as I know. Maybe there was or is, who knows. I've never observed it, so I can't reference it in that model.
Sure,
It's like talking about the
Do you
number
agree-
0.
Do you agree that dinosaurs no longer exist, or they probably don't exist anymore?
Well, they exist. They're birds.
Well, okay, not to get into the G-Men stuff, but
Well, I mean, yeah, but they're. I
Okay.
mean,
you know what I mean.
yeah, exist as they were. Yeah,
So-
they
so
they exist in a different
when I talk
way.
about so when I talk about something being distinguished from nothing, I'm talking about a specific thing. So, you know, say Triceratops, right?
Right.
Triceratops, what distinguishes a non-existing Triceratops from an existing Triceratops?
That's a very odd way to put it. Well, you either when you have a Triceratops, you have something to talk about, and then you wouldn't have something to talk about, I suppose. You just have an absence of Triceratops to talk about.
Well, I don't
And
think
then
that
I mean, I
answers-
guess you're getting into the metaphysics of like how we talk about objects, and
yeah, I'm trying to figure
that's-
out what is being and what is the foundation for being, and I think that's God. But to ask you a different question, what do you mean by evidence? Like, what do you think evidence is?
empirical observed evidence was my first criteria, which means it can be seen, not necessarily just with the naked eye, but with any means that we have at our disposal. So we have heat cameras, we have wave measurements, we have all these different instruments that can allow us
would
to
you agree
see.
that we can't see, for example, we only can see things like black holes indirectly?
Yes, we have a test for that. That comes to my second parameter. So if we don't have observed evidence, we have a repeatable test of some sort that we can perform to know more about the phenomenon in question.
Okay, so with respect to the argument from motion, though, the evidence, the empirical evidence is change. So, it
And
seems
again,
that
change
that's-
only goes back to a certain point in the T time of universe, and then our deductive reasoning halts because, and I think this is where we might depart ways. I view logic as based on observations of the universe as we've come to understand it, whereas I don't know if you view logic as its own separate
Yeah, no,
thing or whatever.
I see it as being deduced from what being is. So being is something that exists, right?
Yeah, so I have very different that the logic as we understand it, the ideas of it, the rules of it are all grounded in how we observe our own universe to be. So if our universe was to change tomorrow and the moon turns out to be green cheese, we have to change logic to accommodate that. So the Michael Jordan fallacy didn't exist until Michael Jordan came along, for example. So until he was there, we didn't have a fallacy to name that.
So you think that before
30 seconds.
You think that before the universe existed, you could have had something that is not what it is?
I have no idea because I at that point we'd have to be able to observe what it was like to talk about it coherently. So there's no way to address what it could or couldn't. We don't know. It's a giant question mark. We have no idea what the rules of logic would be in that sort of universe.
Okay, I think that's all the time.
Yeah.
Yep, that's all the time. Right when Deconverted Man opened a giant
Bring
can
him
of worms
on!
there. So that concludes the debate. Now, both people have agreed that we can open up